But the revolt was somewhat lackadaisical. Initially, few Palestinians actually participated in hostilities, and they were disorganized and poorly led and equipped. By October, they had managed to kill only 28 Britons and 80 Jews, at a cost of some 200 Arab dead. The British and Yishuv reacted with restraint, though London began to curtail Jewish immigration. After 5 months of struggle, the Palestinians were exhausted, and the sterling-earning citrus harvest season was kicking in. The British were happy to call it quits, and covertly helped Hajj Amin al-Husseini suspend the rebellion. London then dispatched to Palestine yet another committee of inquiry, this time a royal commission headed by Lord Peel. On the 7th of July, 1937, the commission published a 404-page report. It exhaustively traced the history of the conflict and present realities, and concluded both that the mandate was unworkable, and that the Jews and the Arabs could not live under one political roof. The commissioners recommended partition, with the Jews getting 20%, the Galilee, and much of the coastal plain, on which to establish a state, and the Arabs getting more than 70%. Samaria, much of Judea, and the Negev, which should eventually be fused with Transjordan to create an enlarged Hashemite state under Emir Abdullah. Something less than 10% of the country, including Jerusalem and Bethlehem, with their holy sites, and a strip of territory connecting the capital to the Mediterranean at Jaffa, should be retained by the British. The Commission further recommended that the bulk of the 300,000 Arabs who lived in the territory earmarked for Jewish sovereignty should be transferred voluntarily under compulsion to the Arab part of Palestine or out of the country altogether. The Commission balanced this by recommending that the 1,250 Jews living in the area earmarked for Arab sovereignty be moved to the Jewish area, deeming the proposed transaction an exchange of population. In their testimony before the Commission, the Zionist mainstream representatives had laid claim to the whole of the land of Israel, the traditional Zionist platform. But in private conversations, Wiseman and others dedicated a readiness for compromise based on partition, as well as, quite probably, suggesting the transfer solution to the demographic problem posed by the prospective large Arab minority in the Jewish area. Zionism's leaders, from Herzl through Menachem Ushishkin and Arthur Rupin, had periodically proposed in private letters and diaries transfer as the requisite solution to the Arab problem. But transfer had never been adopted by the movement or any of the main Zionist parties, including the right-wing revisionists, as part of a platform or official policy. Once the Peel Commission had given the idea its imprimatur, however, the floodgates were opened. Ben-Gurion, Wiseman, Chertok, and others, a virtual consensus, went on record in support of transfer at meetings at the JAE at the 20th Zionist Congress in August 1937 in Zurich, and in other forms. To be sure, these advocates realized and usually acknowledged that the idea was impractical and unrealistic. The British could not be expected to carry out transfer, and the Yishuv, even if willing, was powerless, and transfer was never adopted as official Zionist policy. Yet through the late 1930s and early the mid-1940s, Zionist leaders continued in private to espouse the idea. For example, Wiseman, in late January 1941, told Ivan Meshki the Soviet ambassador to London, if 500,000 Arabs could be transferred, 2 million Jews could be put in their place. Wiseman said that they would be transferring the Arabs only into Iraq and Transjordan. Interestingly, senior British officials and Arab leaders, including Emir Abdullah and Nursi Said, Iraq's premier politician, the same Nuri Said who in July 1939 called for the destruction of the Zionists, shared this view. All understood that for a partition settlement to work and last, the emergent Jewish state would have to be ridded of its large and potentially or actively hostile Arab minority. As Abdullah Prime Minister Ibrahim Pasha Hashim put it in 1946, quote, "The only just and permanent solution lay in absolute partition with an exchange of populations. To leave Jews in an Arab state or Arabs in a Jewish state would lead inevitably to further trouble between the two peoples." Abdullah, according to Britain's representative in Amman, Alec Kirkbride, concurred. The Peel recommendations enshrined the principles of partition and a two-state solution as the international community's preferred path to a settlement of the conflict and were adopted by the mainstream of Zionist movement. The minority right-wing revisionists dissented. But the Husseini-led Palestinian leadership and the Arab states in its wake rejected both the explicit recommendations and the principle. All of Palestine was and must be ours, they said. They also, of course, abhorred the transfer recommendation. Responding to the Peel proposals, which Whitehall immediately endorsed, the Husseinis renewed the rebellion in late September 1937. The opposition, which initially approved the recommendations and then recanted, sought to extend the truce. But vilified as traitors, they were effectively cowed and silenced by a Husseini campaign of terrorism. The second and last stage of the rebellion, lasting until the summer 1939, was far bloodier than the first. The Arab rural bands renewed their attacks and were active in the towns as well. The revisionist movement, military arm, the Irgun Zavi Lumi, IZL, the National Military Organization, or simply Irgun, which had been formed by activist breakaways from the Haganah, subjected the Arab towns to an unnerving campaign of retaliatory terrorism, with special Haganah units adding to the bloodshed through selective reprisals. More important, the British now took off the gloves. In October 1937, they outlawed the AHC and the NC and arrested many of their members. Haj Amin al-Husseini himself fled into exile, where he remained alternating mainly between Beirut and Cairo, until his death in 1974. After the rebellion peaked in summer 1938, the rebels briefly occupied the old city of Jerusalem and Beersheba. And after being temporarily freed by the Munich Agreement from the specter of war in Europe, the British went on the offensive, clamping down hard, between October 1938 and April 1939. British units pushed into the Kasbahs and the rebel strongholds in the hill country and virtually annihilated the bands after coercing much of the rural population into collaboration. Dozens of the houses were demolished, crops were destroyed, rebels and their accomplices were hanged, and thousands were jailed. In suppressing the rebellion, the British fenced and mined Palestinians' northern borders and secured towns and crossroads around the country with reinforced concrete police and army posts called Taggart forts, which were to figure large in the battles of 1948 and mostly exist to this day, serving as Israeli and Palestinian Authority police stations. In identifying the rebels' infrastructure, The British were assisted by the Haganah Intelligence Service, organized toward the end of the rebellion, and by newly created opposition-aligned anti-Husseini peace bands that denied the rebels entry into dozens of villages. There was no formally announced end to the rebellion, but hostilities tapered off in spring and summer 1939, with the surviving rebels fleeing to Lebanon and Syria. Yet the rebellion, coming as it did as British faced the worldwide three-front war against Japan, Italy, and Germany, almost succeeded, not militarily, but politically. From the September 1938 Munich crisis onward, Britain came to view its Palestine policy almost exclusively through the prism of its needs and interest in the forthcoming global struggle. Simply put, London sought to appease the Arabs to assure quiet in the Middle East, which sat astride Britain's lines of communication to southern Asia and the Far East. In May 1939, Whitehall issued a new white paper. It promised Palestine's inhabitants statehood and independence within 3 years, severely curtailed Jewish immigration, limiting it to 15,000 entry certificates per year for 5 years, with all further Jewish immigration conditional on Arab approval, thus assuring an overwhelming Arab majority when independence came, and significantly limited Jewish land purchase. In sum, this amounted to a complete reversal both of the Balfour Declaration policy and its modified translation, the Peel Commission recommendations. Palestine was to remain Arab, and there would be no Jewish state. The Yishuv denounced the white paper as illegal and appeasement, and mounted huge protest demonstrations. The IZL initiated sporadic attacks on British installations. The Palestinian street was overjoyed, but al-Husseini, as was the Palestinians' wont, managed to pluck defeat from the jaws of victory. Instead of welcoming the British move, which Winston Churchill denounced as a cowardly surrender to Arab violence, al-Husseini and his colleagues rejected the white paper. They flatly demanded full cessation of Jewish immigration, immediately British withdrawal, and immediate independence. In the brief months before the war broke out, nothing changed. The Arab revolt thus ended in unmitigated defeat for the Palestinians. Somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 of their political and military activists had been killed, with many thousands more either driven into exile or jailed. The leadership of the Palestinian Arab National Movement was decimated, exiled, or jailed, and a deep chasm characterized by blood feuds divided the society's elite families. Indeed, much of the elite was so disillusioned or frightened by what had happened that it permanently renounced political activity. The Palestinians had also suffered serious economic harm through both the general strike and British repression. They had prematurely expended their military power against the wrong enemy and had been dealt a mortal blow in advance of the battle with the real enemy, Zionism. The damage to their war effort in 1947 to 48 was incalculable. The triangular conflict in Palestine was put on hold for the duration of World War II. The British made it clear to the Yishuv that they would not countenance renewed troubles, and the Jews took heed. They shelved the struggle against the white paper, and tens of thousands of young Jews volunteered for service in the British Army. Even the IZL sent volunteers to aid British military operations. The Zionist movement closed ranks in support of the Allies in the war against the Nazis. Palestine, awash with British troops, served as a giant rare base and workshop for the 8th Army, which engaged the Italians and Germans in North Africa. The Palestinians, reeling from the suppression of their rebellion and largely unsympathetic to Western liberal democratic values, grimly hoped for an Axis victory. In this, they were at once with most of the Arab world. The Palestinians, Khalil al-Sakani, a Christian Jerusalem educator, jotted down in his diary, quote, "Rejoiced, as did the whole Arab world, when the British bastion at Tobruk fell in 1941 to the Germans." Unquote. One of the first public opinion polls in Palestine, conducted by al-Shakakini's son, Sarah Sakakini, on behalf of the American consulate in Jerusalem in February 1941, found that 88% of the Palestinian Arabs favored Germany and only 9% Britain. The exiled al-Husseini himself helped raise a brief anti-British revolt in Baghdad in spring 1941, and then fled to Berlin, where he served the Nazi regime for 4 years by broadcasting anti-British jihadist propaganda to the Middle East and recruiting Bosnian Muslims for the Wehrmacht. He was deeply anti-Semitic. He later explained the Holocaust as owing to the Jews' sabotage of the German war effort in World War I, and the millennia of Gentile anti-Semitism was due to the Jews' character. One of the most prominent facets of the Jewish character is their exaggerated conceit and selfishness, rooted in their belief that they are the chosen people of God. There is no limit to their covetousness, and they prevent others from enjoying the good. They have no pity and are known for their hatred, rivalry, and hardness, as Allah described them in the Quran. But World War II was a crucible from which both the Jewish and Arab national movements would emerge strengthened and largely triumphant. The war's vast weakening of British and French power and the concomitant rise of national consciousness and ideologies in the Third World resulted almost immediately in the liberation from imperial rule of vast domains stretching from Indonesia through India to the Arab Middle East. At war's end, Transjordan, later Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon became independent, and other Arab territories, including Egypt and Iraq, enjoyed a loosening of the imperial grip. Yeah, I imagine the new budget demands in Great Britain in the aftermath would demand something like this. Okay, we can't hold it down anymore. No one thinks of the money. Well, I wouldn't say that. Anyway, rambling. For the Jews, the World War meant, above all, the Holocaust. But while destroying Zionism's main potential pool of manpower, Eastern European Jewry, the Holocaust also re-engineered the movement as a powerful vehicle of the victimized and stateless, who now enjoyed the international community's sympathy. In a larger sense, history was repeating itself to the benefit of Zionism. As the pogroms in Russia in the 1880s had launched modern Zionism, so the largest pogrom of them all propelled the movement almost instantly into statehood. And much as World War I had issued in the first important statement of support for a Jewish national home, the Balfour Declaration, so the aftermath of World War II, resulted in that decisive international warrant, the United Nations Partition Resolution of 29th of October 1947, which would underpin the emergence of the State of Israel. In effect, the white paper policy remained in force through the war, even though Churchill, a pro-Zionist, had taken over the premiership in London in May 1940. In October 1941, he had written, quote, "If Britain and the United States emerge victorious from the war, the creation of a great Jewish state in the Palestine inhabited by millions of Jews will be one of the leading features of the peace conference discussions." Unquote. But during the war, there was in fact little Churchill could do apart from winning the war quickly enough to save at least some of Europe's Jews. A secret cabinet committee he had set up in 1943 had recommended, as he had sought, a switch in British policy in favor of partition, but it was never acted upon. And although Churchill was continuously peeved by the Arabs' pro-Axis behavior, he knew full well that Britain needed a quiescent Middle East in the rear of its fighting formations and could not afford to, there's that word, to rile them over Palestine. As Colonial Secretary Malcolm MacDonald put it, if there was trouble in Palestine, there would be repercussions in Transjordania, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, and even echoes of that trouble in India. But Churchill did authorize the establishment of both the Palma, a guerrilla strike force of Haganah members, to be used if the Germans conquered Palestine, and the Jewish Brigade, a large formation composed mainly of volunteers from the Yishuv that fought with the British Army in Italy. The veterans of both were to stand the Yishuv in good stead in the 1948 war. In the first months of the World War II, Zionist organizations stepped up efforts to save European Jews from the impending massacre and to strengthen the Yishuv by bringing them to Palestine through an illegal immigration operation run mainly by the newly created Institute for Illegal Immigration, Hamossad Li'aliyah Bilti Legalit, a secret arm of the Haganah. The British countered with a Royal Navy cordon that intercepted the rickety steamers, and many were stopped and their passengers reshipped to detention camps in Mauritius and later Cyprus. But by mid-1941, both Zionist and British efforts had become largely irrelevant. The Germans had overrun Europe and closed its ports while changing their policy towards the Jews from one of encouraging emigration to initiating mass murder. Few Jews reached Palestine from Europe during 1941 to 1945. Nonetheless, the war significantly speeded up the march toward Jewish statehood. In January 1942, Chaim Weizmann, in an article in Foreign Affairs, explicitly demanded the establishment of a Jewish state in all of Palestine, and in May, an extraordinary Zionist conference attended by most leaders of American Zionism, a number of exiled European Zionist leaders, and 3 members, including Ben-Gurion, of the GAE from Jerusalem, formalized this demand by voting to support what became known as the Biltmore Program, drafted by Meyer Weisgall, a Weizmann aide. Meeting at the Biltmore Hotel, New York, the delegates called for the land of Israel to be established as a Jewish commonwealth integrated in the structure of the new post-war democratic world. By commonwealth, they meant state. This was to remain Zionist policy down to the end of 1947. Palestine remained under British control, and the 1939 White Paper continued to guide Whitehall's policies. But during the first 2.5 years between the end of the World War II and the start of the First Arab-Israeli War, developments on the ground in Washington, Palestine, and Europe were to prove more important than the character and mindset of the Whitehall's mandarins, of their calculations and declarations. In the United States, the Jews decisively won the battle for the hearts and minds of the American people and its leaders, due to the impact of the Holocaust and effective Zionist propaganda. The existence of the 5 million strong Jewish community proved extremely important. The Jews themselves, energized and united by the Holocaust, were well organized and wealthy and were traditionally big donors to political campaigns. They also tended to vote in high numbers, were concentrated in such key electoral states as New York and California, and were by tradition Democrats. It was Zionism's luck that Democrats controlled the White House and Congress during the war and post-war years. Perhaps the surprising thing is that despite Jewish clout, the administration of President Franklin D. Roosevelt had managed during the 1930s and the first years of the war to desist from anything but insignificant expressions of sympathy for Zionism. Roosevelt avoided a forthright commitment to Jewish statehood. The plight of European Jewry may have weighed heavily on the side of Zionism, but American global interest, as they emerged in the war against Germany, Italy, and Japan, and as perceived by most senior officials in the relevant departments, state defense, militated in the other direction. The officials worried about the continued supply of oil, American bases and open lines of communication, as well as, from the war's end, countering Soviet influence and power. The continued goodwill, or at least neutrality, of the Arab world remained a major American interest. In May 1943, Roosevelt assured King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia that both Arabs and Jews would be heard before the powers decided on the contours of the post-war settlement in Palestine. But the last months of the war saw a dramatic gradual shift in American policy. In March 1944, the White House, under pressure from various departments, may have persuaded Congress to withdraw a joint resolution calling on Britain to rescind the White Paper and supporting a Jewish state, but Roosevelt assured the Jews that full justice will be done after the war to those who seek a Jewish national home, for which our government and the American people have always had the deepest sympathy, and today, more than ever, in view of the tragic plight of hundreds of thousands of homeless Jewish refugees. During the second half of 1944, both the Republicans and the Democrats included in their election platforms pro-Zionist provisions, with the Republican presidential contender, Governor Thomas Dewey, declaring support for the establishment of a Jewish Commonwealth in Palestine. At Yalta, in February 1945, Roosevelt, in conversation with Joseph Stalin, described himself as a Zionist, to which the Soviet dictator rejoined, "Me too," but then he added that Jews were middlemen, profiteers, and parasites. Though the following month Roosevelt assured Ibn Saud that he would support no action that would prove hostile to the Arab people. The growingly Zionist orientation of American public opinion, fueled by the revelation of the full horror of the Holocaust, proved inexorable. Roosevelt's sudden death in April clinched the Zionist victory in Washington, with the more sympathetic Vice President Harry Truman taking over the White House. Truman was not the committed philo-Semite or Zionist Arab propagandist and Zionist politicians later made out. In 1944, Truman had pointedly declined to support his party's pro-Zionist platform, and he reportedly told his cabinet in July 1946 that he had no use for them, the Jews, and didn't care what happened to them. Without doubt, he was often annoyed and even angered by the perpetual Zionist importunings, blandishments, cajolery, and pressure to which he was subjected during 1945 to 1948. And once converted to supporting partition, he was pessimistic about the outcome. Quote, "I fear very much that the Jews are like all underdogs. When they get on top, they are just as intolerant and cruel as the people were to them when they were underneath." But in August 1945, in Potsdam, Truman came out in principle to support of resettling the Holocaust survivors, the Jewish displaced persons, DPs, in Palestine, in response to which Arab League Secretary General Abd al-Rahman's Azam declared that this could touch off a new war between Christianity and Islam, as had the medieval Crusades. Azam had long been tagged by the British as intransient, Back in 1939, he had told Weizmann that there was nothing for it but a fight to the death against the Jews. Truman pointedly asked the British Prime Minister to lift the restrictions on Jewish immigration to Palestine. Soon, this had crystallized into open support for the immediate resettlement in Palestine of 100,000 DPs. For Palestine's Arabs, the war years passed without significant change. True, their financial assets grew substantially because of Allied spending and investment, but militarily and politically things remained much the same. Few, perhaps 5,000 or 6,000, signed up with the Allied armed forces or otherwise gained military experience. There was no increment in local military force or organization, and the political and military leadership that had been shattered in 1938 to 1939 remained either in exile, neutered, or hors de combat. But by mid-1943, it had become increasingly clear to Palestinian and outside Arab leaders that the Allies would win and that, whatever their true feelings, the Arabs had better at least edge towards, if not jump outright onto the bandwagon. To gain anything from the Allied victory in the post-war settlement, Palestine's Arabs would need to have recognized leadership and an organization capable of managing the coming struggle and reaping its possible rewards. During 1943, the former heads of Palestine's Istiqlal Party, Avni Abdul Ali Hadi, Rashid Haj Ibrahim, and Ahmed Hilmi Pasha, launched an effort to reunite the Palestinian nationalist movement. In August, Ahmed Hilmi began to reorganize the Arab National Fund, designed to counter Jewish land purchasing, and in November, the 15th Conference of the Palestinian Arab Chambers of Commerce met in Jerusalem and set in motion process to elect new Palestinian national representation. The Istiqlalist platform called for the rigid implementation of the provisions of the 1939 White Paper. Because of Husseini opposition, matters hung fire. But not to be outdone, the Husseinis also began to reorganize. True, their main leaders were in exile. Haj Amin in Berlin serving the Nazis, and Jamal Husseini interned in southern Rhodesia. But the remaining local leadership, spearheaded by Emil Guri, a Greek Orthodox journalist, in April 1944 formally relaunched the Palestine Arab Party, whose central demands were immediate Palestinian Arab independence, the cessation of Jewish immigration, and the dissolution of the Jewish national home. By September, the Husseinis were once again the most active and powerful political faction in Arab Palestine. Returning to the fray, the Palestinians led the Husseinis on Balfour Declaration Day, 2nd of November, launched nationwide protest. The repoliticization of Palestine's Arabs at war's end coincided with British support drive for pan-Arab unity, which had captivated the political imagination of the Middle East since before World War I. During the 25th of September, 7th October 1944, delegates from 7 Arab countries met in Alexandria and founded a League of Independent Arab States, henceforth known as the Arab League. On the 22nd of March 1945, these states formally signed a pact in Cairo. A secretariat was set up in the Egyptian capital, with the Egyptian Abdi el-Rahman Azam as Secretary General. The Palestinians had sent Musa al-Alami to the gathering in Alexandria. He was designated first an observer, then a delegate. The Palestinian Arab community thus enjoying, at least theoretically, an equal footing with existing or emergent Arab states. At the end of the conference, the delegates issued the Alexandria Protocol. A section was devoted to the issue of Palestine. The Arab states resolved that Palestine constitutes an important part of the Arab world, and that the rights of the Palestine Arabs cannot be touched without prejudice to peace and stability in the Arab world. The League endorsed the demand for a stoppage of Jewish immigration, the cessation of land sales, and independence for Palestine. In light of the international circumstances, almost universal horror over the Holocaust, and growing American pressure to resettle the remnants of European Jewry in Palestine, the Arab states declared that they were second to none in regretting the woes which have been inflicted on the Jews by European dictatorial states. But the question of these Jews should not be confused with Zionism, for there can be no greater injustice and aggression than solving the problem of the Jews of Europe by another injustice, that is, by inflicting injustice on the Palestine Arabs. To add cogency to their demands for a voice in the expected post-war settlement, 4 of the states, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia, in early 1945 declared war on the Axis, thus assuring membership in the nascent United Nations organizations, the heir to the interwar League of Nations. The establishment of the Arab League at once strengthened the Palestinian cause and weakened the voice of Palestinian nationalism. Right? On one hand, the Arab states collectively weighed in behind Palestinian Arab demands. But at that time, the pact gave the member states the right to select who would represent the Palestinian Arabs in their councils, so long as Palestine was not independent. Coupled with the continued factional deadlock within Arab Palestine, this assured, in the words of one historian, that the initiative in Palestine Arab politics thus passed to the heads of the Arab states, and major political decisions on the organization of Arab resistance to Zionism were thereafter taken not at Jerusalem, but at Cairo. You see, right? The Arab League is formed, right? Just on a personal note. They consolidate, they come together, they resist the mandates that are occurring in Palestine, but make no mention of forming a Palestinian state. Why? Because it interfered with their personal drives to be the heads or leaders of such an organization or movement. You see, when you can't govern yourself, be prepared to be governed or rot. I'm sorry. And indeed, it was to be the initiative of the Arab League that in November 1945 the AHC was reestablished as the supreme executive body of the Palestine Arab community. Months of haggling between the factions had failed to produce agreement. Gee, you don't say. A 12-month member, AHC was appointed with 5 Husseini representatives, 2 independents, and 5 other members, including Garib Nashanashibi, representing the other, now resurrected, pre-1939 parties. But the return to the Middle East of the Mufti's cousin, Jamal Husseini, and renewed Husseini opposition, quarreling, precipitated the disbandment in March 1946 of the re-established AHC. The opposition set up its own organization, the Arab Higher Front, and Jamal reconstituted an AHC, manned only by Husseini family members and affiliates. In June, to break the stalemate, the Arab League foreign ministers intervened and nominally replaced both the AHF and the new AHC, imposed upon the Palestinians a new leadership body, the Arab Higher Executive, AHE, with Hajj Amin al-Husseini as absent, chairman and Jamal Husseini as vice chairman. The Husseinis were now firmly back in the saddle, this time with the imprimatur of the Arab League. Haj Amin now returned to the Middle East from his temporary refuge in France and began directing Palestinian Arab affairs from Cairo. In January 1947, the 9-member AHE was renamed the AHC. The Palestinian Arabs appeared once more to have a relatively unified, if not particularly representative, leadership. The Yishuv rises. But viewed against the political shadowboxing, developments in the Zionist camp proved to be far more significant. If the outbreak of the World War had put an almost immediately break on Jewish resistance to the White Paper, its approaching end opened the floodgates. No longer was there need to close ranks in the fight against the Nazis. The Third Reich was finished. Moreover, Europe was awash with hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors desperate to rebuild their lives away from the killing fields, and if it was up to the Zionists to resettle in Palestine. But Britain, meaning the cabinet in London, the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, and the Secretary forces in Palestine, stood between the DP camps and the Promised Land. On the 27th September 1945, the Zionist leadership proclaimed that the blockade was tantamount to a death sentence upon those liberated Jews, still languishing in Germany. A revolt that had been postponed for 6 years was now about to break out. Already in May 1943, Field Marshal Harold Alexander, commander of Britain's forces in the Middle East, had warned London that there was a probability of an anti-British revolt by the Yishuv at war's end. The Jews mean business and are armed and trained. A year earlier, in mid-1942, SIME, Secret Intelligence Middle East, the Middle Eastern arm of Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, had estimated fairly accurately that the Haganah had 30,000 members with arms for 50 to 70% of them. The IZL could field another 1,000 trained men with several thousand supporters. The Yishuv had not wasted the war years. More than 26,000 of its men and women had joined the British Army and acquired a measure of military training. Arms had been stolen or illegally purchased, and Haganah members had increased, most significantly in May to June 1941. The Haganah, with British assistance, as mentioned earlier, had established a small permanent strike force, the Palma, an abbreviation of Plugot Mahats, or shock companies, headed by Yitzhak Sadeh, the veteran Red Army soldier and Haganah commando leader. The Yishuv leadership regarded the Palma as both an instantly available crack force to fend off Arab attacks and as a commando unit to be used against the Nazis should the Afrika Korps conquer Palestine. As it turned out, the Germans failed to break through the Allied defenses in Egypt. Nonetheless, the Palma saw some action. On June 1941, it provided 40 scouts and sappers who accompanied the Allied units that invaded Vichy-controlled Lebanon and Syria. It was at Iskenderun, in brackets, in southern Lebanon, that leading one reconnaissance squad, Moshe Dayan, lost his eye to a Vichy sniper. And during 1943-1945, the Palma provided the British with some 24 saboteurs and radio operators who were parachuted into Nazi-occupied Europe to link up with partisan units and threaten Jewish communities. From 1942, the Palma constituted a small standing army. Its platoons dispersed among several dozen kibbutzim and 2 or 3 towns. The recruits put in a fortnight each month working in the fields to cover their upkeep, and devoted the rest of their time to training. By war's end, the Palma had grown to some 2,000 men and women. But another group first disturbed the calm in Palestine. Already in the war's first months, British installations were periodically attacked by the LHI, Luhami Herut Yisrael, or Freedom Fighters of Israel, dubbed the Stern Gang by the British. The organization was established in 1939 to 1941 by several dozen breakaway IZL members who opposed the truce with the British. The LHI, led initially by Abraham Yair Stern, continued to view the British, not the Germans, as the Jewish people's main enemy. It was the British who were preventing Jews from escaping Europe, reaching Palestine, and attaining independence. At the end of 1940, the LHI tried to establish an alliance with Nazi Germany for the common struggle against Britain. An operative named Natali Nubinsek was sent to Beirut, where he made contact with Otto Werner von Hentig, a German foreign minister official and intelligence officer, and explicitly offered military, political, and intelligence cooperation. But Berlin was uninterested. Lubinsek returned to Palestine, where the British jailed him. But Stern was not easily deterred. At the end of 1941, some months after the beginning of the Holocaust, with the Afrika Korps at the gates of Egypt, Stern tried again. He dispatched one of his deputies, Natan Friedman Yellen, to make contact with German officials in Turkey, with instructions to propose that Germany allow out hundreds of thousands of Balkan Jews. What he was to offer the Nazis in return is not clear. In any event, he got only as far as Aleppo, where Allied police picked him up. Nor did the LHI's campaign in 1940 to 1943 in Palestine amount to much. The LHI's minute-size Haganah and IZL tip-offs and effective British clampdowns saw to that. LHI operations were limited almost completely to thefts of weaponry, sometimes from Jewish caches rather than British military stockpiles, and bank robberies. In one payroll heist, in January 1942, LHI gunmen shot dead 2 Histadrut officials. But starting in 1944, the British faced a far more serious challenge. On the 1st of February, several days after Menachem Begin, a leader of the revisionist movement in Poland and ex-Polish army officer, took over command of the organization. The IZL announced the resumption of the armed struggle. The war in Europe was near its end, and Britain was still barring the door to Palestine. The IZL, like the LHI, and some senior mainstream Zionist leaders felt that the Arabs were insignificant. The main battle for Jewish statehood would have to be fought against the British. During February, IZL squads blew up government immigration and income tax offices. In March, they attacked a series of police buildings. On the 17th of May, IZL squads raided the British radio station in Ramallah, and on the 22nd August, attacked the British police headquarters in Tel Aviv, Jaffa. On the 27th September, the organization attacked police stations in Beit Dajan, Quilya, Haifa, and Quatra. On the 8th of August, the LHI tried to assassinate the High Commissioner in Palestine, Harold McMichael. The mainstream Zionist leadership and press roundly condemned the dissidents' attacks. The Irgun members were labeled misguided terrorists, young fanatics crazed by the sufferings of their people into believing that destruction will bring healing. Under Zionist mainstream pressure, the LHI suspended its attacks in November 1944, after its members assassinated the British Minister of State in the Middle East, Lord Moyni in Cairo, Lord Moyne. But the IZL defied the GAE and continued to its attacks. The Haganah declared an open hunting season. In Zionist historiography, the Sison, against the IZL and Haganah intelligence and Palma teams systematically assaulted and incarcerated IZL members, confiscated their weapons, caches, and occasionally handed them or their names and addresses to the British. The season lasted from November 1944 March 1945. But the changed international situation and growing activist rumblings within the Haganah eventually issued in a radical change of tack. The end of the war in Europe triggered the end of the war in Europe triggered the reopening of the struggle against the white paper by mainstream Zionism. In June, a Jewish agency memorandum demanded that Britain allow 100,000 immigrants into Palestine immediately. The DPs could not be allowed open-endedly to languish in Europe among the graveyards of the millions of their slaughtered brethren, Ben-Gurion declared. Churchill wondered whether Britain could cast off the burden of Palestine. "I do not think," in quotes, "we should take the responsibility upon ourselves of managing this very difficult place while the Americans sit back and criticize," he wrote on the 6th of July. Quote, "I am not aware of the slightest advantage which has ever accrued to Great Britain from this painful and thankless task. Somebody else should have their turn now." But Churchill never got the chance. In the general elections that month, he was swept from office and a Labour government headed by Clement Attlee took over. Ernest Bevin, no friend to Zionism, became Foreign Secretary. In August, Bevin proposed that immigration to Palestine be limited to 1,500 per month. Wiseman and Ben-Gurion demurred, and so within weeks would Truman. Truman had sent Earl G. Harrison, the U.S. representative on the International Government Committee on Refugees, to visit the European DP camps, many of them run and financed by the American occupation authorities. Harrison found that the DPs wanted to immigrate to Palestine and recommended that Britain immediately issue 100,000 additional entry certificates. Truman forwarded the recommendation to Attlee with an in-principle endorsement. In mid-October 1945, ignoring a British request for discretion, Truman publicly supported the 100,000 recommendation. London was furious. The diplomatic drama played out against the background of increasing anti-British violence in Palestine. The IZL and the LHI, who had continued to attack police stations, telephone poles, and banks, were joined in early October by the Haganah, nonplussed by the result of the British elections and Labour abandonment or betrayal of the Zionist cause the year before. The Labour Party executive had even advocated the transfer of Arabs out of the prospective Jewish state. The three armed groups negotiated a formal accord as the Hebrew Rebellion Movement. Tenuat Hamorai Ha-Ivri. And on the night of 9th and 10th of October, several Palma squads raided the British detention camp at Atlit and freed 208 incarcerated illegal immigrants. What followed was even more dramatic. On the night of the 1st of November, Palma sappers blew up railway tracks at 153 points, around Palestine, and a few days later destroyed a patrol vessel and 2 British Coast Guard stations at Givat, Olga, and Sayyidna Ali. The British reacted by raiding a handful of kibbutzim, which were suspected of housing illegal immigrants, and panicky troops killed 9 civilians and wounded 63. Anti-British emotions crested. Bombings of British installations continued through the winter and spring, culminating in the spectacular simultaneous destructions by Palma sappers on the night of June 1946 of 11 bridges connecting Palestine to Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. Meanwhile, the Haganah renewed its illegal immigration campaign. Boats were intercepted by the Royal Navy and their passengers in turn, but others got through. Between the August 1945 and 14, May 1948, some 70,700 illegals landed on Palestine's shores. The Zionist leadership, understandably, used the plight of the DPs to further Zionist goals, even occasionally risking and sacrificing lives to further the movement's ends. As the leaders understood, Britain's dilemma was stark: to stick to its guns and flatly reject Truman's 100,000 proposal would jeopardize the cornerstone of British foreign policy, the Anglo-American alliance, at a time when American goodwill was vital on a broad front of political, military, and economic issues, containing Soviet expansionism, keeping the British pound afloat, and so on. But to allow the 100,000 into Palestine would enrage the Arab world and invite renewed rebellion in Palestine and possibly general turbulence in the Middle East. A foretaste was provided on the 2nd of November 1945, when Arab mobs rioted across the Middle East and North Africa, burning Jewish shops, homes, and synagogues in Alexandria, and slaughtering about 100 Jews in British-governed Tripolitania, Libya, in brackets. Whitehall chose the path of least resistance, the establishment of yet another committee of inquiry, this time jointly with the Americans. At the very least, it would buy a few months, and perhaps it would result in mobilizing Washington to share cost and or responsibility. The British wanted the committee to focus on the DPs with Palestine to be omitted from the terms of reference. Washington objected. The appointment of the Anglo-American Committee, AAC, was announced on the 13th November. The threat of the Anglo-American rupture was averted, and the Haganah briefly suspended its attacks to enable the inquiry to go forward in an atmosphere of relative calm. The 12-man committee was instructed to examine political, economic, and social conditions in Palestine as they bear down the problem of Jewish immigration and settlement therein, and to examine the position of the Jews in those countries in Europe where they have been victims of Nazi and fascist persecution, to assess how they might be reintegrated in those countries, and to make the estimates of those who wish or will to be impelled by their conditions to migrate to Palestine or other countries outside Europe. The AAC, the 12 Apostles, as they were dubbed, was chaired by a British judge, Sir John Singleton, and included the American Quaker Frank Idlewood, director of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, James MacDonald, former League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees from Germany, Pulitzer Prize winner Frank B. Buxton, a former editor of the Boston Herald, and lawyer Bartley Crum, and British Labour Party MP and assistant editor of the New Statesman and National Richard H.S. Crossman, Conservative Party MP Reginald E. Manningham Buller, and Labour's Lord Robert C. Morrison. In launching the committee, Bevan preempted its recommendations by publicly setting out Britain's short and long-term goals. He hoped that the committee would propose relieving Britain of the mandate and replacing it with an international trusteeship. After a time, an independent Arab majority state would be established. He warned the Jews not to push their way to the head of the quay, lest they trigger an anti-Semitic reaction. Meanwhile, Britain would curb Jewish immigration, imposing a ceiling of 1,500 entry certificates a month. The Jewish Agency denounced Bevan's prejudging the committee's findings. During February and March 1946, the committee studied the situation of the DPs in Europe, toured the Middle East, and heard out Arab and Zionist representatives and British officials. Some outside observers, such as philo-Zionist South African Prime Minister Jan Smuts and Dr. Walter C. Loudermilk, an expert on agricultural development, were also consulted. The Palestinians' Arab Office, headed by Musa al-Alami, cautioned the AAC against regarding Jewish colonialization in Palestine and Arab resistance to it in terms of white colonization of America and Australia and the resistance of the Red Indians and Aborigines. Nor would Zionist engendered prosperity persuade the Arabs to shelve their opposition to a movement that was bent on their dispossession. That they didn't possess. The Jewish Agency presented a report that emphasized Arab, and specifically Palestinian Arab, backwardness and Zionism's role as a bearer of enlightenment and progress. The agency offered reams of statistic and graphs to demonstrate Zionist beneficence. Of particular effect was the month the committee members spent touring DP camps, especially in Poland. Jewish Agency agents working behind the scenes made sure that the committee met and heard only Jews propounding the Zionist solution. Of course. The committee found that the displaced Jews in Poland lived in an atmosphere of terror, with pogroms an everyday occurrence. Indeed, some 1,500 Jews were slaughtered by anti-Semitic Poles in the year following the end of World War II. After the war, the committee members were persuaded of the need for wholesale immigration of the DPs to Palestine. Before reaching Palestine, the members visited Arab capitals. At Riyadh, King Ibn Saud told them, "The Jews are our enemies everywhere. Wherever they are found, they intrigue and work against us. We drove the Romans out of Palestine." How, after all this sacrifice, would a merchant, that is Jew, come and take Palestine out of our hands for money? Ibn Saud then presented each member with a golden dagger and an Arabian robe and headdress and showed off his harem. He offered to find Judge Singleton a spouse. In the hearings in Palestine, the Jewish leaders again offered statistics and graphs and argued that the Arabs already had a number of states. The Palestinian Arabs did not need a separate state or their own. Ben-Gurion banned all but mainstream Zionist spokesmen from appearing before the AAC, though defying the leadership. Hebrew University President Yehuda Leib Magnes also testified, advocating a binational solution. The Arabs preferred to impress the AAC with a sumptuous luncheon at Katie Antonius's or a ceremonial visit to a large estate rather than any systematic marshalling of facts and figures to make a convincing presentation. But perhaps more important than the formal testimony were the committee's tours around the country. The contrary realities of Zionist and Arab existence left an abiding impression. After visiting Kibbutz Mishmar HaEmek at the western edge of the Jezreel Valley, Crossman wrote, "I've never met a nicer community anywhere. By contrast, 200 yards down the road, he later reported, was the stenchiest Arab village I have ever seen, where Crossman was treated to tea on the earthen floor of a filthy hovel." And Idalot later wrote, "I left Washington pretty strongly anti-Zionist, but when you see at first hand what these Jews have done in Palestine, the greatest creative effort in the modern world, the Arabs are not equal to anything like it and would destroy all that the Jews have done. This we must not let them do." Buxton was later to compare the Haganah to the American Revolutionary Army, a rabble in arms in the fine sense. The AAC's report was released simultaneously in Washington and London on May the 1st. It represented, roughly, a compromise between the views of its two component blocks, the American and British. The committee accepted the most of the DP's wish to settle in Palestine and recommended that 100,000 entry permits be issued as rapidly as conditions will permit. The committee sympathized with the propensity of each side to regard Palestine as its homeland and rejected partition. For the short and medium term, the AAC recommended that the British mandate be converted into or continued under the guise of a United Nations trusteeship. Later, Palestine should be granted independence within a unitary or binational framework. The AAC's recommendations were unanimous. But the AAC had done nothing to heal the basic Anglo-American rift. Truman once again endorsed the passage of 100,000 DPs to Palestine and approved the scrapping of the White Paper's land sale provisions, which the AAC had deemed discriminatory. Attlee ruled out mass immigration until the Yishuv was disarmed, which he knew was a non-starter. The Jewish Agency endorsed the report's immigration recommendation, but rejected all the rest. The Arabs rejected everything. They demanded immediate independence for an Arab-ruled Palestine, not binationalism. Yeah, they could demand that, but even if it was handed to them on a platter at that point, they'd start fighting amongst themselves, and they'd be no better off. I mean, that's obvious. It's already been proven, a few pages back. Whatever that might mean, and called for an immediate cessation of immigration. One Foreign Office cable, in the wake of the report, spoke of Arab hatred of the Jews as being greater than that of the Nazis. The AHC, in a letter from Jamal Husseini to Attlee, issued an ultimatum and threatened jihad. In a follow-up interview with British High Commissioner Sir Alan Cunningham, Husseini declared his willingness to die for the cause. When Cunningham responded that this doesn't really trouble him, and that what worried him was the welfare of the ordinary Arab population, Husseini rejoined that they were prepared to die too. Oh, yeah. Thanks for volunteering. Yeah. The publication of the report triggered violent demonstrations in Baghdad and Palestine. In Beirut, an U.S. information center was set on fire. At least one Baghdad newspaper called for jihad. The Arabs must proclaim a crusade that is holy war, to save the Holy Land from the Western gang which understands only the language of force. Another called on the Arabs to annihilate all European Jews in Palestine. The AAC report was officially condemned by the Arab League Council meeting at Blunden, Syria on the 8th to 10th June 1946. Yeah, but that's all PR considerations. Give me a break. The publication of the report led to a resumption of Jewish attacks on British targets culminating in the Palma's Night of the Bridges. On the 29th June, the British responded with Operation Agatha, dubbed in Zionist historiography Black Sabbath, designed to cripple the Haganah. For 2 weeks, the security forces scoured Jewish towns and rural settlements for men and arms, even occupying the Jewish agency buildings in Jerusalem, which in fact contained a Haganah headquarters, and arrested 4 JAE members, including Shertok. But HIS had obtained advanced warning, and most Haganah commanders escaped the dragnet. The operation only marginally affected Haganah capabilities. But politically, while further damaging Britain's image in the United States, the operation persuaded the JAE, meeting in Paris in early August 1946, to abandon the path of military confrontation. However, Black Sabbath also provoked vengefulness, with the IZL ironically taking up the cudgel for its sometime enemy, the Haganah. With faulty coordination with the Haganah, IZL sappers on the 22nd of July placed a number of bomb-laden milk containers in the basement of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which served as a British military and administrative headquarters. The resulting explosion, which brought down one of the hotel's wings, was the single biggest terrorist outrage in the organization's history. The IZL subsequently claimed that it had given the British ample warning, but that they had failed to evacuate the building. The British maintained that no adequate warning had been given. 91 British, Arab, and Jewish officers and officials died. In response, the commander of the British forces in Palestine, Lieutenant General Sir Evelyn Barker, issued a non-fraternization order in which he had accused all of Palestine's Jews of complicity in the outrage. British personnel were barred from frequenting Jewish homes or businesses, or to have any social intercourse with any Jew, in order to punish the Jews in a way the Jews in a way the race dislikes as much as any, by striking at their pockets. Barker was subsequently rebuked by Attlee, but was not removed from command. The upshot of the violence and the Anglo-American discussions about the AAC report in summer 1946 was the Morrison-Grady, or Provincial Autonomy Plan, Britain's last effort to devise a compromise. The plan left defense, foreign affairs, and most economic matters in British or international trusteeship hands, while subdivided into 4 cantons. Jews and Arabs were offered a measure of local autonomy, responsible for municipal affairs, agriculture, education, and so on. Basically, yeah, you run things, we rule things. Fuck. The plan also provided for an immediate transfer to Palestine of 100,000 DPs and eventual independence for Palestine as a unitary or binational state. In September, the British convened a conference in London attended by British officials and representatives of the Arab states to discuss the plan. But nothing came of it. The Zionists, who did not attend, insisted on Jewish statehood, and the Arabs demanded immediate Arab independence. The American response was equally unequivocal. On the 4th of October 1946, Truman formally rejected Morrison-Grady, hesitantly endorsed partition and Jewish statehood, a solution, he said, that would command the support of public opinion in the United States, and called for an immediate start to substantial immigration. Truman's statement was in large measure prompted by the upcoming midterm American elections. Attlee was bowled over. He complained that Truman did not wait to acquaint himself with the reasons for the plan. Meanwhile, the Haganah pressed on with its illegal immigration campaign. On the 27th January 1947, the British took one last shot at resolving the crisis. They reconvened the London Conference, this time with the AHC represented. But the Zionists continued to boycott the talks, and the United States declined to send an observer. The Arabs continued to refuse anything short of complete, immediate independence, and the Jews anything less than Jewish statehood in all or part of Palestine. With no acceptable military solution to the Jewish guerrilla terrorists and illegal immigration campaigns, and with no political solution to the Zionist-Arab impasse, Britain had reached the end of the road.